When people hear the word Crusades, they often imagine something simple: Christian knights marching east beneath crosses, Muslim armies resisting them, Jerusalem at the center, and centuries of holy war stretching out in a straight line. It is one of the most familiar medieval stories and one of the most misunderstood. The Crusades were not one war. They were not even one idea. They were a chain of campaigns, sermons, vows, massacres, pilgrimages, dynastic gambles, failed logistics, spiritual promises, political improvisations, and commercial opportunities that remade the Mediterranean world over the course of centuries. They were born in a moment of anxiety and ambition, but they did not remain fixed to that beginning. They changed the papacy, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Near East, the Latin West, maritime trade, military orders, memory, law, and the language of legitimate violence. They helped define the medieval imagination of sanctified war. They also showed, again and again, how quickly lofty ideals could be entangled with greed, fear, opportunism, and catastrophe. If there is a single mistake modern viewers make with the Crusades, it is the mistake of assuming that everyone involved understood them in the same way. They did not. The Pope who preached the First Crusade, the French knight who sewed a cross onto his tunic, the Byzantine emperor hoping for military aid, the Armenian Christian watching armies pass, the Muslim merchant in Aleppo, the Jewish family in the Rhineland, the Italian shipowner in Venice, the peasant who believed his sins might be forgiven through the journey, the military order brother living under vows in a fortified house, the Egyptian administrator trying to fund resistance, and the later chronicler turning defeat into providential language. None of these people lived inside the same story, even if later generations tried to press them into one. To understand how the Crusades remade the Mediterranean, we have to start before the call to crusade itself, in a world already under pressure. The 11th century was not an age waiting passively for a great event. It was a period of intense political reorganization across Europe and the Near East. In the Latin West, power was fragmented, lordship was personal, violence was habitual, and the church was increasingly engaged in reform movements that sought to discipline both clergy and lay elites. The papacy was changing. Popes were no longer content merely to preside spiritually, while emperors and kings dominated political life. The great reform popes of the 11th century pushed claims about clerical purity, papal independence, and the right of the church to judge the moral life of Christendom. This was the age of the investiture contest, an age in which the papacy and secular rulers fought openly over authority, legitimacy, and who had the right to shape Christian society. Violence existed everywhere, but the question of who might direct violence for righteous ends was becoming newly urgent. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire remained a major power, but not an invulnerable one. Constantinople was still one of the greatest cities in the world, wealthy, learned, ceremonially magnificent, and strategically placed at the hinge of Europe and Asia. The empire still saw itself as Roman, and not without reason. Yet military and political pressures had mounted. The decisive defeat at Manzikert in 1071 to the Seljuk Turks did not instantly destroy Byzantium, but it exposed weakness and accelerated the loss of much of Anatolia, the empire's military and fiscal heartland. Anatolia was not merely a frontier space. It had long been essential to imperial recruitment, grain, taxation, and strategic depth. Its destabilization shook the entire Byzantine system. The Islamic world, too, was anything but uniform. It is tempting to speak of the Muslims as if the Crusades confronted one coherent bloc. In reality, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were fractured by rival dynasties, sectarian differences, local loyalties, and shifting priorities. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad remained symbolically important, but real power had long since slipped into the hands of military rulers, local dynasts, and, increasingly, the Seljuk Turks. Cairo, under the Fatimid Caliphate, represented a rival center of power, rooted in Ismaili Shirai claims and its own imperial ambitions. Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul, Jerusalem, Antioch, and countless smaller cities and regions were governed by authorities whose interests did not always align. The political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean before the Crusades was therefore one of fragmentation and competition, not of easy unity. Pilgrimage connected these worlds in complex ways. Long before armies marched under crusading vows, Christian pilgrims from Western Europe traveled to Jerusalem and other holy sites. Pilgrimage was arduous, costly, and spiritually meaningful. It linked local devotional life in the West to sacred geography in the East. Yet pilgrimage also rested on political conditions, safe passage, local arrangements, and shifting regimes. Stories of danger to pilgrims circulated in Europe, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes grounded in real insecurity. Such stories mattered because they made distant sacred geography feel morally urgent. A Christian might never see Jerusalem, yet Jerusalem could still shape his imagination. It was not simply another city. It was the city of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. To imagine it under non-Christian control, even in a world where such control had long been the reality, was to open a space for emotional and theological intensity. Then came the moment that later generations would treat as the beginning. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II preached what became the First Crusade. The exact wording of his speech is uncertain because multiple versions survive, written down later by different authors, each colored by memory and agenda. But the broad force of the message is clear enough. Urban called on Christians of the West to aid Eastern Christians and to turn their violence outward against enemies rather than inward against fellow Christians. He attached the language of pilgrimage to armed action. He held out spiritual reward, including the remission of sins, to those who undertook the expedition in proper spirit. That was revolutionary. The Church had long blessed warfare under certain conditions, but here was a pope summoning a trans-regional armed movement toward the east and wrapping it in penitential and salvific meaning. War, pilgrimage, and penance were being fused into something new. The response astonished even those who had hoped for enthusiasm. Thousands took the cross. Some were nobles with resources, armed followings, and political ambitions. Some were lesser knights hoping for honor, land, salvation, or all three. Some were clergy and monks. Some were ordinary people with little grasp of logistics, but enormous emotional fervor. The movement that gathered in the wake of Clermont was not controlled in any simple way. The later image of tidy crusading armies marching under centralized direction is misleading. The First Crusade began in disorder. There were aristocratic contingents, yes, led by major figures such as Raymond of St. Gilles, Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, and others. But there were also waves of poorly organized popular enthusiasm, most notoriously associated with figures like Peter the Hermit. Apocalyptic expectation, rumor, social strain, and spiritual hunger surged together. One of the darkest signs of what crusading energy could become appeared before the main armies even reached Byzantium. In the Rhineland and elsewhere, crusading mobs and associated groups attacked Jewish communities, producing massacres that remain among the most horrifying episodes of the era. These attacks were not incidental side notes. They revealed that once sacred violence had been authorized in expansive terms, some participants turned it first against vulnerable neighbors. Church authorities and local rulers sometimes tried to stop the violence, sometimes failed, and sometimes were complicit by weakness or indifference. The Crusades did not invent anti-Jewish violence in Europe, but they intensified and sacralized it in new ways. The road to Jerusalem, before it ever reached the Levant, had already left blood behind in Europe. When crusading contingents reached Byzantine territory, another profound tension became visible. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had indeed sought Western military aid, but he had not invited an uncontrolled tidal wave of armed Latin zeal. He wanted disciplined assistance, ideally mercenary or allied forces that could help recover territory in Anatolia. What he got was a succession of Western leaders and masses whose motives were not identical to his and whose cultural assumptions were often profoundly alien to the Byzantine court. Alexios had reason to fear them almost as much as he needed them. Oaths were demanded. Negotiations were tense. Latin chroniclers often portray Byzantine caution as duplicity. Byzantine sources often portray Western crusaders as unruly, arrogant, and dangerous. Both perceptions had enough truth in them to feed long-term mistrust. The early stages of the First Crusade nevertheless produced real military momentum. At Nicaea in 1097, Cooperation between Byzantines and Crusaders helped secure success, though the terms of surrender generated mutual suspicion. The Crusaders then moved into Anatolia and won a difficult victory at Dorylaeum. The march itself was punishing. Heat, thirst, stretched supply lines, local resistance, and sheer distance turned crusading from an idea into a bodily test. People died not only in battle but by exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. Yet hardship also deepened the sense among many participants that they were engaged in a providential struggle. Survival could be read as divine favor. So could improbable victory. Religious conviction and military experience fed each other. At Antioch, the First Crusade encountered one of its great ordeals. The siege, beginning in late 1097 and continuing into 1098, became a brutal contest of starvation, engineering, betrayal, improvisation, and psychological endurance. Antioch was no minor objective. It was a great city with immense strategic and symbolic importance, and taking it would secure a path deeper into the Levant. But the Crusaders were themselves almost destroyed in the attempt. They suffered hunger so severe that later accounts speak of eating animals, leather, and worse. Discipline frayed. Desertion occurred. Leadership tensions sharpened. Then, after the Crusaders finally entered the city through treachery from within, they themselves were besieged by a relief army. It was during this desperate reversal that one of the most famous relic episodes of the Crusades emerged, the alleged discovery of the Holy Lance. Whether fraud, sincere piety, or desperate morale building, the event reveals something essential. In moments when military survival seemed impossible, the crusading movement turned repeatedly to signs, relics, visions, and providential interpretation to sustain itself. Antioch also exposed a problem that would shadow all subsequent crusading politics. Who would own victory? Byzantium expected recovered cities to revert to imperial authority. Crusader princes increasingly expected to hold what they conquered. Bohemon's seizure of Antioch for himself after the city fell made clear that the First Crusade was not simply an expedition of pious restoration. It was also becoming a process of Latin state formation in the East. Ideals of aid to Eastern Christians and recovery of land from Muslim rule now overlapped with dynastic ambition and lordship. The crusading movement was producing not only battles and pilgrimages, but new political entities. Then came Jerusalem. In June 1099, the Crusaders reached the city that had been the emotional pole of the entire movement. Jerusalem was then under Fatimid control, not Seljuk, a reminder again that the Muslim political landscape was fractured. The siege lasted roughly 6 weeks. The city fell on July 15, 1099. What followed entered memory as both triumph and horror. Latin Christian sources framed the capture as the fulfillment of sacred purpose, the end of ordeal, the visible reward of God. Muslim and Jewish memory preserve the massacre. Men, women, and children were killed. Sacred space was saturated with violence. Later romanticization cannot undo the simple fact. Jerusalem was taken through blood, and many of the conquerors understood the shedding of that blood not as a stain on their mission, but as confirmation of it. This is one of the defining features of crusading ideology. It did not simply tolerate violence under exceptional necessity. It could interpret violence itself as purification, as judgment, as sacred instrument. That did not mean every crusader delighted in slaughter or that all accounts can be taken literally. Medieval narrative is often rhetorical and symbolic. But the capture of Jerusalem demonstrates how crusade could authorize a form of holy war in which mercy narrowed and religious exaltation intensified the logic of conquest. To later generations, this would become one of the deepest wounds left by the Crusades. And yet, if we stop at Jerusalem in 1099, we miss the larger transformation. The First Crusade did not end with a pilgrimage fulfilled. It left behind states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli formed what are often called the Crusader States or Latin East. These were not mere military outposts. They were settler lordships, legal systems, fiscal regimes, ecclesiastical structures, networks of castles, ports, and aristocratic families attempting to root themselves in an Eastern environment they had entered by conquest. They depended on continuing support from Europe, local alliances, maritime supply, and the ability to survive amid more numerous surrounding populations whose languages, customs, and faiths differed from their own. How exactly did these states function? Not as simple colonial transplantations, though there were elements of that. Latin elites ruled over diverse populations, Eastern Christians of various rites, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, and others. Governance required adaptation. Frankish rulers could not simply erase the existing social world and replace it. They needed taxes, local knowledge, food supplies, translators, administrators, and diplomatic flexibility. In many places, coexistence in daily life was more practical and layered than the rhetoric of holy war would suggest. This did not mean equality or harmony. It meant that conquest had to become administration, and administration is often more complicated than ideology. The military orders emerged from these conditions. The Templars and Hospitallers began differently, but both became central institutions of crusading society. The Templars combined monastic vows with military service in a way that would have once seemed bizarre. The Hospitallers, rooted in charitable care, likewise developed into a formidable military power. These orders embodied the fusion at the heart of crusading: poverty and wealth, prayer and war, institutional discipline and aristocratic violence, local defense, and trans-Mediterranean fundraising. They drew donations from Europe, managed properties, developed organizational sophistication, and projected a new model of sanctified armed service. Their existence alone demonstrates how thoroughly the Crusades reconfigured Latin Christianity. Fighting in God's service was no longer merely a metaphor or occasional necessity. It had become a vocation. The Muslim response to the Crusader states was at first less unified than later memory suggests. This is not because Muslim societies failed to grasp the seriousness of the Frankish presence, but because local rivalries, dynastic competition, and the practical demands of ruling fragmented the field. Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul, Cairo, and other centers had distinct priorities. Yet the continued existence of the Crusader states created a lasting irritant and challenge that eventually encouraged wider projects of political and military consolidation. Here the Crusades become a story not only of Western expansion, but of how that expansion helped reshape Islamic politics in the Eastern Mediterranean. The first major turning point in that reshaping came with the rise of Imad al-Din Zengi, and, still more dramatically, with the fall of Edessa in 1144. Edessa was the weakest and most exposed of the Crusader states, but its loss sent shock waves through the Latin West. The response was the Second Crusade. If the First Crusade had been astonishingly successful against expectations, the Second would reveal how unstable crusading success actually was. Preached by figures as important as Bernard of Clairvaux and joined by major rulers, including Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, it seemed at first an immense show of European commitment. Yet the campaign faltered disastrously. Poor coordination, difficult marches, suspicion toward Byzantium, and strategic misjudgment culminated in failure at Damascus, a target whose choice remains one of the era's most puzzling and self-defeating decisions. The Second Crusade demonstrated that royal participation and high rhetoric did not guarantee military coherence. Failure mattered because crusading was always a moral as well as strategic enterprise. Defeat demanded explanation. Was God punishing sin? Were leaders arrogant? Were allies treacherous? Had the crusading ideal been corrupted? Such questions would recur after almost every failed campaign. The Crusades were not only wars. They were interpretive crises. Participants and observers needed to explain why sacred violence sometimes worked and sometimes collapsed into embarrassment. In the decades after the Second Crusade, Muslim political consolidation advanced more effectively. Nur al-Din emerged as a major ruler in Syria, combining military energy with ideological seriousness in ways that later Muslim chroniclers would present as a model of pious rulership. His career helped shape the environment in which the most famous Muslim leader of the crusading era would rise, Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin's later fame, both in Islamic memory and even in some Western romantic imagination, can obscure the complexity of his rise. He was not simply the destined Muslim answer to the Crusades. He was a political actor navigating the tangled legacies of Fatimid Egypt, Zingid Syria, Sunni revival, dynastic interest, and military necessity. Saladin's achievement was enormous precisely because he managed to do what many before him had not: unite enough of Egypt and Syria under one authority to make a sustained challenge to the Crusader states possible. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, by contrast, entered the 1180s weakened by internal faction, dynastic instability, and strategic overconfidence. Figures such as Raynald of Chatillon pushed aggressive provocations that risked wider war. The resulting confrontation would culminate at Hattin in 1187. The Battle of Hattin is one of the truly decisive engagements of the crusading era. The Crusader army, drawn into arid terrain near the horns of Hattin and deprived of water, was broken by Saladin's forces. The relic of the true cross was captured. Key leaders were taken. Military disaster opened the road to Jerusalem. Hattin was not merely a lost battle. It was the collapse of the Crusader state's military center of gravity. When Jerusalem fell later that year to Saladin, the event reverberated through Latin Christendom with a force comparable to the shock produced by Edessa, but deeper, more existential. The city whose conquest had justified so much now appeared lost through sin, division, and divine judgment. Yet the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin was also markedly different from the conquest of 1099. Later memory sometimes idealizes his conduct too much, but by comparison with the massacre of the First Crusade, his taking of the city was indeed more restrained. Ransoms were demanded. Captivity and suffering remained real, but the city was not submitted to the same annihilating slaughter. This difference became important in memory. Saladin could be represented as both formidable enemy and chivalric counterpart, especially in later Western literature that preferred noble adversaries to the memory of its own brutalities. The loss of Jerusalem launched the Third Crusade, perhaps the most famous in popular memory because of its cast: Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and Saladin. Yet even here the legend is cleaner than the reality. Frederick drowned en route. Philip and Richard quarreled. Richard proved a brilliant commander in several engagements and recovered significant coastal positions, but he did not retake Jerusalem. The Third Crusade demonstrated again that crusading could produce extraordinary feats of travel, finance, and war, while still failing to achieve its most symbolically charged objective. The settlement that emerged allowed continued Christian access to holy places, but left Jerusalem under Muslim control. This was no small matter. Pilgrimage, diplomacy, and pragmatic compromise all now existed alongside the older rhetoric of total sacred recovery. If the Third Crusade became famous through personalities and battlefield drama, the Fourth Crusade became infamous through betrayal and redirection. Called originally to attack Muslim power, it was diverted into the politics of debt, Venetian ambition, and Byzantine dynastic conflict. In 1204, Crusaders sacked Constantinople itself, the greatest Christian city in the eastern Mediterranean. The event was catastrophic for Byzantium and morally shattering for the ideal of crusade. A movement launched, in part, to aid Eastern Christians had ended in the looting of their capital by Western Christians. Churches were desecrated, treasures seized, and political trust between Latin and Greek Christians poisoned still further. The sack of Constantinople is one of the clearest examples of how crusading could be turned by commercial and political incentives far from its nominal spiritual target. Venice's role in the Fourth Crusade reveals another underappreciated truth. The Crusades were inseparable from maritime power and commercial networks. Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and others, did not simply transport pilgrims and armies. They leveraged crusading for commercial privileges, ports, warehouses, and influence. The Mediterranean was being remade not just by holy war, but by convoys, contracts, shipbuilding, insurance, and the politics of supply. Crusade and commerce fed one another in uneasy but highly productive ways. Ports in the Levant became nodes in wider networks of exchange. Spices, textiles, sugar, luxury goods, slaves, and information moved through systems that crusading violence did not stop, but often intensified or redirected. This is one of the largest ways in which the Crusades remade the Mediterranean. They did not simply produce battles between faiths. They thickened contact. They moved people, relics, technologies, stories, and commercial expectations across sea lanes and overland routes. Western Europeans learned more about Eastern luxuries, fortification techniques, administrative sophistication, and the possibilities of maritime empire. Eastern societies learned how persistent and adaptable Latin armed piety could be. Diplomatic languages expanded. So did resentment. The Mediterranean became more deeply interconnected even as it became more violently contested. The later crusading centuries make less narrative sense if one expects a single rising and falling arc. There were crusades against Muslim powers in the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, but there were also crusades in Iberia against Muslim-ruled territories, crusades in the Baltic against pagan peoples, crusades against heretics such as the Cathars, and campaigns authorized by papal language of crusade for conflicts that would once have seemed far from Jerusalem. This diffusion matters. It shows that crusade became not merely an event, but a portable institutional technology. Once the papacy had developed a way to authorize war as penitential and meritorious, that way could be applied elsewhere. The Crusades changed the Mediterranean, but they also changed Europe's moral and political vocabulary of war far beyond the Mediterranean. The Albigensian Crusade in southern France is a perfect example. Here, crusading rhetoric and privilege were directed not at Muslims, but at Christians deemed heretical. The violence was appalling. Entire communities were targeted. Regional politics, royal interests, ecclesiastical reform, and doctrinal enforcement fused into one campaign. The lesson is important. Crusading did not simply define an external religious enemy. It could be turned inward against those the church or papacy sought to discipline. Holy war became a tool of internal order as well as external expansion. The Baltic Crusades similarly reveal the colonial potential of crusading. Pagan peoples in northeastern Europe became targets of conquest justified in religious terms, but also deeply entangled with land acquisition, lordship, and settler expansion. Here again, crusade authorized not just battle but remaking of space, hierarchy, and law. If the Mediterranean remained the movement's most famous theater, the wider crusading world extended much farther. Back in the Levant, the Crusader states entered their later centuries as increasingly fragile coastal enclaves, dependent on fortifications, maritime supply, intermittent Western assistance, and the military order's discipline. The balance of power had shifted. Muslim polities, particularly under the Ayyubids and then the Mamluks, developed more coherent capacity to squeeze the remaining Latin positions. Castles, ports, and pilgrim routes still mattered, but the age in which a relatively small Western expedition could carve out multiple states through shock and local division had passed. The Fifth Crusade, aimed at Egypt, demonstrates the recurring strategic logic and recurring failures of the later movement. Egypt was recognized as a key center of Muslim power. Strike there, and one might bargain for Jerusalem. In practice, the campaign suffered from poor coordination, environmental difficulty, and political rigidity. Damietta was taken and then lost. Opportunity was squandered. The pattern is familiar by now: immense mobilization, moral drama, logistical strain, and strategic disappointment. The Sixth Crusade under Frederick II remains unusual because it achieved, through negotiation rather than major battle, a temporary restoration of Christian control over Jerusalem in the 1220s. Frederick was himself an extraordinary and controversial figure, more comfortable with diplomacy and multilingual statecraft than crusading piety as conventionally performed. His recovery of Jerusalem through treaty angered some and impressed others. Yet it also underscored that the language of sacred victory could coexist with pragmatic arrangement. Jerusalem was important enough that its possession could be renegotiated, but unstable enough that any settlement rested on shifting political ground. By the mid-13th century, the Mamluk Sultanate under rulers like Baybars would drive the final destruction of many remaining Crusader strongholds. Acre, the last major Crusader possession in the Levant, fell in 1291. The age of Crusader states in the Holy Land effectively ended there. Yet the Crusades as idea and institution did not end so neatly. Calls for new crusades continued. Plans were made. Preachers preached. Taxes were raised. The dream of recovering the Holy Land remained emotionally alive long after the practical basis for doing so had decayed. In that sense, the Crusades outlived their own geopolitical conditions. So what did they change? At the broadest level, they helped create a Mediterranean in which Latin Christian powers were more outward-looking maritime, and institutionally prepared for long-distance military and commercial projection. The Italian republics gained commercial advantages and experience that would matter for centuries. Military orders became trans-regional institutions with wealth, land, archives, and political influence. The papacy reached a new height of ideological command over warfare, even as repeated failures and abuses also exposed the limits of papal power. Nobles and kings learned that crusading could be used for prestige, internal legitimacy, and dynastic theater, even when the stated spiritual objectives remained elusive. The Crusades also reshaped the Islamic world, though not in the simplistic sense of provoking permanent unity. They encouraged rulers and chroniclers to frame resistance in terms of jihad more consistently and politically. They contributed to projects of unification in Syria and Egypt. They sharpened elite awareness of the need for disciplined military response, fortified frontiers, and ideological legitimacy. Yet Muslim memory of the Crusades was not always as immediate or singularly defining in the medieval period as modern people sometimes assume. For long stretches, local power struggles and later Mongol invasions loomed larger. Memory is never static. The Crusades would be remembered differently in different centuries, just as they are invoked differently today. For Byzantium, the Crusades were doubly destructive. The empire had initially sought help and instead gained unpredictable allies, territorial complications, and finally the catastrophic sack of Constantinople. The Latin Empire established after 1204 never possessed the coherence or legitimacy to replace Byzantine rule effectively. Even after Byzantium recovered Constantinople in 1261, the empire was weakened irreversibly. If one wants to trace long-term consequences, the Fourth Crusade stands out as one of the greatest self-inflicted disasters in medieval Christendom, widening the fracture between Latin and Greek Christianity and undermining one of the major Eastern powers that might otherwise have played a different role in later Mediterranean history. Socially and culturally, the Crusades intensified xenophobia and cross-cultural knowledge at the same time. This is not a contradiction once one understands how contact works. People learn more about those they fight, trade with, preach against, and negotiate with. They absorb objects, techniques, stories, insults, and fascinations. The Latin West view of Islam remained shaped by polemic and caricature in many contexts. Yet Western Europeans also encountered sophisticated urban life, luxury goods, medical knowledge, mathematics, and legal systems through Mediterranean contact that was thickened by crusading routes and regimes. None of this means the Crusades were a civilizational exchange program in disguise. That sentimental formulation empties them of their violence. It means only that violent contact transforms both enemies and systems, often in ways none of the participants would have described in humane language. The effects on Christian piety were profound. The crusading vow, the use of the cross as wearable sign, the idea of armed penance, the accumulation of indulgences, the connection between relics and military morale, the sanctification of journey itself. These became part of Western devotional culture. Pilgrimage and warfare were joined in the crusading imagination so tightly that the boundaries between self-purification and enemy destruction became unstable. This is one of the movement's deepest moral legacies. It helped normalize a model in which violent action could be framed not simply as regrettable necessity, but as spiritually meritorious. That model did not disappear with the last Crusader fortress. It continued to shape Christian political theology and later colonial mentalities in subtler forms. One can also see the Crusades remaking law and administration. Financing expeditions required taxation, loans, record-keeping, pledges of property, inheritance planning, and coordination across vast regions. Rulers and church authorities expanded fiscal techniques to support crusading efforts. Maritime law, contracts, and transport systems all developed under pressure. Castles in the Levant and elsewhere pushed military architecture. Intelligence, diplomacy, and language skills became more valuable. A movement founded on penitential fervor generated bureaucratic consequences. Holy war needed accountants. Memory of the Crusades began almost immediately. Chronicles in Latin, Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Hebrew, and vernacular languages turned events into moralized narratives. Heroes were made, traitors named, miracles reported, defeats explained. The chroniclers mattered because later generations would inherit the Crusades through their lenses. William of Tyre, Ibn al-Qalanisi, Ibn al-Athir, Usama ibn Munkid, Fulcher of Chartres, Anna Komnene, and many others did not simply preserve the Crusades. They shaped them. Their biases, anxieties, rhetoric, and regional vantage points helped determine what later readers thought the Crusades had been. History here is inseparable from the struggle over narration. Usama ibn Munkid is especially revealing because his writing captures the strange, daily coexistence that ideology alone cannot explain. He could despise Frankish crudity in one passage and recognize familiarity or even friendship in another. Such writing reminds us that the Mediterranean world of the Crusades was not lived entirely at the pitch of battlefield hatred. There were truces, medical exchanges, personal relations, jokes, commercial interactions, and negotiations. Human beings kept being human beneath the grand abstractions of holy war. That does not soften the violence. It makes the world more real. And yet the violence must not be diluted. Cities were taken by slaughter. Rural communities suffered raiding and taxation. Jewish communities in Europe faced catastrophic attacks connected to crusading fervor. Muslims and Eastern Christians in the Levant endured conquest, dispossession, and long insecurity. Crusaders themselves died in astonishing numbers from combat, starvation, disease, shipwreck, and exposure. The Mediterranean was remade in part because so much force was poured into it under sacred authorization. One cannot understand the Crusades by isolating the piety from the killing or the killing from the piety. Their historical power lies in the fusion. The Crusades also helped create enduring myths of the Mediterranean as frontier, bridge, and prize. This sea had always connected civilizations, but crusading turned it into a more explicitly militarized zone of sacred and commercial competition between Latin Christian powers, Byzantine interests, and Muslim polities. Islands, ports, straits, and coastal cities acquired amplified importance. Control of sea lanes mattered as much as cavalry charges. Naval transport, siege supply, and port diplomacy became central to campaigns that Romantic memory often imagines as all horses and desert battles. In truth, the Mediterranean was not merely the setting of the Crusades. It was one of their chief protagonists. When later centuries looked back, they often selected the parts of the Crusades most useful to themselves. Romantic nationalists could celebrate chivalry. Imperial powers could invoke civilizing missions. Religious polemicists could resurrect old enmities. Scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries sometimes oscillated between admiration for Western energy and horror at fanaticism, depending on their own era's politics. In the modern period, the word crusade itself has been stretched far beyond its medieval origins, often carelessly, sometimes explosively. It can still function as a metaphor of righteous campaign, and that alone tells us how deep its historical imprint remains. But historical seriousness requires resisting both romantic nostalgia and flattening condemnation. The Crusades were not a timeless war of civilizations. They were a set of medieval projects born from specific institutional, theological, and political conditions. Nor were they a mere misunderstanding between cultures that would have gotten along peacefully, but for a few bad leaders. They were rooted in real structures of competition, piety, fear, and expansion. To understand them is not to excuse them. It is to grasp the machinery that made them possible and the world they helped create. One of the strongest arguments that the Crusades remade the Mediterranean lies in the fact that even their failures changed the balance of things. Failed expeditions still moved money, bodies, relics, fleets, and expectations. They still burdened kingdoms, enriched ports, empowered preachers, altered alliances, and left stories behind. Not every crusade ended in conquest, but almost every crusade left a trail of institutional and emotional consequences. Repeated mobilization normalized the idea that the Mediterranean could be crossed and contested repeatedly by Western Christian powers under papal sanction. That mattered enormously for later histories of trade, state formation, and seaborne empire. The Crusader states themselves, though ultimately doomed, were laboratories of adaptation. Castles such as Croix de Chevaliers, port cities like Acre, and patchworks of lordship under conditions of demographic minority forced Latin elites to learn governance under pressure. They borrowed, translated, imposed, negotiated, and fortified. They were neither seamless colonial successes nor mere military camps. They were unstable, hybrid frontier societies, and frontier societies change those who inhabit them. The Franks of the East were not simply Western Europeans frozen in place. Over generations, they became something regionally conditioned, even as new arrivals from Europe kept refreshing older assumptions. Food, too, belongs in this story. Sugar cultivation, citrus knowledge, spices, and the economics of agricultural transplantation all tied the crusading world to broader Mediterranean developments. The Crusades did not invent these commodities, but they participated in reworking how Western elites desired and obtained them. Taste is historical power in a quiet form. A Mediterranean remade by Crusade was also a Mediterranean in which appetites, luxuries, and systems of extraction were being reconfigured. So were ideas of kingship. Crusade could elevate rulers who took the cross or tarnish those who failed conspicuously. It became part of the political theater of monarchy. Kings could present themselves as champions of Christendom, defenders of holy places, penitential warriors, or pious disappointments. The intersection of crusading and monarchy mattered from Louis VII to Richard I to Louis IX and beyond. Louis IX's crusades in the 13th century, especially to Egypt and then Tunis, reveal both the persistence of crusading idealism and the degree to which it could now become a performance of sanctified kingship even when strategic logic was weak. His personal piety was unmistakable. So were the disasters and immense costs. Louis IX's capture in Egypt during the Seventh Crusade should remind us again how little noble intention guaranteed result. The Nile Delta, disease, political miscalculation, and local resistance could crush even highly sanctified royal effort. Yet Louis's sainthood later ensured that crusading failure would not prevent moral glorification. This too is part of the crusading world. Military defeat could be transmuted into spiritual prestige if the interpretive machinery around it was strong enough. By the late Middle Ages, new pressures, above all the rise of the Ottoman Turks, would reshape Christian and Muslim strategic worlds in ways different from the earlier crusading centuries. But the legacy of crusading remained in the institutions, memories, and moral languages available to later actors. Even when the Mediterranean's political map changed, the conceptual map drawn by centuries of crusades still influenced how people imagined sacred geography, legitimate war, and civilizational contest. And this may be the final reason the Crusades matter so much. They expose how easily transcendence can be armed. A movement that promised salvation, penance, and defense of the holy could generate massacres, state formation, financial innovation, architectural change, maritime transformation, and centuries of memory. It could inspire genuine sacrifice and astonishing endurance. It could also justify atrocity and betrayal with a cleansed conscience. The Crusades did not simply reveal medieval fanaticism. They revealed a more universal danger, that people who believe themselves to be instruments of sacred necessity can reorder entire worlds while convincing themselves that violence has become virtue. When the First Crusade set out, the Mediterranean was already a connected sea. By the time the crusading age had run its major course, it had become a more militarized, commercially integrated, ideologically sharpened, and institutionally transformed arena. Ports were richer or ruined. Dynasties had risen and fallen. Byzantium had been maimed. Muslim rulers had consolidated and counterattacked. The papacy had discovered both the reach and the limits of mobilized holy war. Merchants had learned how war and trade could thicken each other. Chroniclers had built memory architectures that still shape modern imagination. The sea itself had not changed. Everything around it had. That is what the Crusades made. Not a single Christian triumph or Muslim resistance story, but a remade Mediterranean in which piety, profit, fear, power, and movement were bound together more tightly than before. Holy war did not replace politics. It deepened politics. It did not suspend economics. It energized economics. It did not freeze identities. It radicalized and multiplied them. And once set in motion, those changes could not be confined to Jerusalem or even to the Levant. They spread outward through Europe, Byzantium, North Africa, and the wider Islamic world, leaving institutions, myths, scars, and ambitions behind. If you stand far enough away, the Crusades can look like a series of banners moving across maps. Up close they are stranger and more human, a frightened pilgrim, a hungry knight, a Jewish mother hiding her children, a Byzantine court official calculating danger, a Muslim merchant watching new rulers arrive, a monk preaching salvation through war, a ship captain counting profit and holy transport, a sultan trying to unite rivals, a chronicler deciding what the whole thing would mean after the blood dried. History is made at that distance and at that intimacy. The Crusades remade the Mediterranean because they operated in both registers at once. And that is why they still matter. Not because they can be reduced to lesson, slogan, or civilizational caricature, but because they show, with unusual clarity, how religion, politics, and violence can fuse into engines powerful enough to reshape a world. The Mediterranean that emerged after the Crusades was not simply more divided. It was more entangled, more fortified, more connected, more suspicious, more commercial, and more haunted by memory. The sea remained the same water. The people around it no longer inhabited the same political and moral landscape. That landscape had been remade. One vow, one massacre, one port, one relic, one treaty, one failed expedition, and one conquered city at a time. To see how far the Crusades reached, we should linger a little longer on the papacy. Before Urban II, the papacy had already been transformed by reform, conflict, and a sharpened claim to moral authority over rulers. But after Clermont, the Pope's role in directing Christendom acquired a new instrument. A Pope could summon not merely prayer and discipline, but movement. He could call warriors from multiple kingdoms into a shared act and promise them spiritual reward for participation. That did not make the papacy omnipotent. Far from it. The history of the Crusades is full of papal frustration, ignored commands, diverted expeditions, and rulers who took the cross for reasons partly or largely their own. Yet the capacity to frame warfare as a penitential Christian duty represented a major expansion in papal ambition and in the institutional imagination of Latin Christendom. This expansion had legal consequences. Who qualified for crusading privileges? What counted as fulfilling a vow? What happened if someone took the cross and failed to go? How were taxes justified for crusade? What exemptions applied? Medieval canonists and administrators had to create systems for these questions. Crusade became a category that law had to describe. Indulgences, property protections, debt arrangements, guardianship of families and lands left behind, the transfer or suspension of legal obligations. These were not merely side effects. They were part of the machinery by which a devotional military movement became durable enough to recur. A feature on an app should think of this as institutional scaffolding. The crusading ideal survived because institutions made it administratively survivable. If one asks what crusading looked like to people who did not belong to the knightly elite, the answer depends heavily on class, region, and situation. Peasants, townspeople, artisans, and rural clergy could experience the movement as spectacle, burden, opportunity, or disaster. Preachers visiting towns and villages aroused intense emotion. Relic processions, public sermons, and the ritual taking of the cross turned crusade into something visibly communal. Yet funding armies also meant taxation, requisition, and pressure. When relatives departed, households lost labor. When rulers borrowed or taxed for crusade, subjects bore the consequences. For many, crusading was not a glorious adventure, but a process that reallocated local resources toward a distant sacred political project whose results they could not control. Women's roles in crusading society are also larger than the stereotype of waiting wives allows. Noble women managed estates while husbands or sons traveled east. Queens and aristocratic women sometimes shaped crusading politics through patronage, diplomacy, or pressure. Women accompanied crusade expeditions, though their presence often alarmed clerical moralists who preferred cleaner narratives of sanctified masculine violence. In the crusader states themselves, Latin, Eastern Christian, Muslim, and Jewish women lived within societies transformed by conquest, taxation, marriage politics, and legal layering. If crusade remade the Mediterranean, it did so in households and property systems as much as in battlefields. Marriage alliances, widowed inheritances, dowries, guardianship, and female piety all intersected with the movement's long life. One can see the complexity of daily life in the Crusader states by looking at language and law. The Franks did not magically produce an entirely separate world. They inherited or adapted local systems. Courts could vary by population and jurisdiction. Latin elites might use interpreters, scribes, and local administrators. Arabophone and Greek-speaking communities continued to exist under Latin rule. Armenians, Syriac Christians, Jews, and Muslims all navigated new hierarchies with different degrees of leverage. This was no harmonious pluralism. Conquerors taxed and ruled, yet they also needed what the conquered knew. That dependence shaped the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that pure ideological narratives cannot capture. Castles are one of the most visible physical remains associated with the Crusades, and they too reveal layered realities. To modernize, Crusader castles often appear as symbols of domination, massive, austere, and obviously military. They were that, but they were also administrative centers, storage points, refuges, and statements. They announced permanence in landscapes where permanence was uncertain. Their design absorbed influences from Byzantine, Islamic, and earlier local fortification traditions, even as Western builders brought their own assumptions. Fortification is a dialogue conducted under threat. The castles of the Levant show how quickly supposedly separate civilizations learn from one another when survival requires it. Croix de Chevaliers is perhaps the most famous example, but it should not stand alone in the imagination. Coastal fortifications, inland redoubts, towers, walls, and urban defenses all formed part of a militarized environment in which Crusader states and their enemies watched roads, taxed movement, guarded crops, and staged campaigns. The Mediterranean that emerged from crusading was not only ideologically changed, it was physically refortified. Space itself was reorganized to anticipate raid, siege, and counter-siege. The military orders deserve further attention because they were among the most original institutions of the age. The Templars, founded to protect pilgrims and later transformed into an extraordinary trans-regional network, combined vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience with military service in a way that challenged older assumptions about monastic life. Their white mantles with red crosses became iconic, but symbols can obscure mechanics. The order's true significance lay in its international organization, property network, financial sophistication, and semi-corporate durability. It owned lands in Europe, commanded manpower, handled transfers of money, and maintained a presence in the East. In modern language, it fused religious order, military core, banking network, and landholding institution. No medieval state or church could ignore such an entity for long. The Hospitallers evolved differently, but no less significantly. Originating from charitable care for pilgrims, they retained a stronger hospital identity even as they became major military actors. Their later afterlives in Rhodes and Malta would ensure that the crusading movement's institutional legacy continued centuries after the fall of the Latin East. These orders demonstrate that crusading was not exhausted when a campaign failed or a city fell. It sedimented into durable organizations whose wealth, archives, and military habits would keep shaping Mediterranean politics. And then there is Venice, perhaps the clearest example of a power that understood earlier than most how to turn crusading mobility into geopolitical leverage. Venetians were not uniquely cynical in a world full of opportunism, but their maritime position and commercial intelligence made them exceptionally effective at converting transport into influence. If crusaders needed ships, then shipowners and port powers mattered. This transformed the balance between inland warrior aristocrats and maritime republics. The Crusades did not create Venice's ambitions, but they accelerated the conditions in which those ambitions could operate at imperial scale. The Fourth Crusade remains the most notorious example, yet Venetian influence was broader and longer. Freight, armed escort, maritime insurance, port installations, diplomatic outposts, and neighborhood enclaves in eastern cities all became part of the story. The sea routes of the Mediterranean grew denser with obligations and opportunities tied to war. Pilgrims became cargo, armies became contracts, ports became bargaining chips, and holy purpose became inseparable from shipping schedules. A movement remembered for cavalry charges was, in practice, deeply dependent on hulls, sails, rope, and the willingness of maritime powers to calculate advantage from devotion. The Islamic side of this story has often been flattened in Western retellings into a sequence of villains and occasional noble antagonists. That flattening is not merely unfair. It prevents understanding. The rulers, military elites, scholars, merchants, and ordinary townspeople of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were not a single reactive mass. Their responses to the Franks evolved over time, and much depended on local politics. Some Muslim rulers made truces with Crusader states against Muslim rivals. Some prioritized nearby enemies or internal disputes over anti-Frankish mobilization. Some courts used the rhetoric of jihad more strongly than others, and at different moments. The process by which anti-Crusader struggle became a stronger, legitimizing language was historical, not automatic. Nur al-Din's court is crucial here. His image in later Muslim historiography is one of pious rulership disciplined toward jihad and justice. Whether or not every later idealization should be taken literally, his reign did represent a major stage in integrating anti-Frankish warfare with a broader Sunni political program. Saladin inherited and transformed that world. His achievements are inseparable from Egypt. Without control of Egypt's wealth and strategic depth, resistance to the Crusader states could not have been organized on the same scale. Here the Mediterranean becomes intensely material again. Grain, revenue, fleets, and Nile region resources mattered as much as sermons or battlefield charisma. Saladin's later memory in Europe is itself worth notice. Medieval and early modern Christian literature could portray him as an enemy and yet admire his generosity, self-control, or magnificence. This does not make him a proto-liberal hero in any modern sense. It shows how crusading societies could stabilize their own self-image by imagining worthy adversaries. A contemptible enemy is easy to condemn, but a noble enemy helps a culture narrate its own defeats without dissolving into humiliation. Saladin became useful to Western memory because he allowed Western writers to say, in effect, that Jerusalem had fallen not to barbarism, but to a prince whose greatness echoed their own ideals of rulership and chivalry, even if those ideals were often projected backward. This reciprocal myth-making is one of the reasons the Crusades continue to matter. They generated not only new political structures, but also enduring repertoires of heroism, betrayal, and civilizational identity. Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond, and later Louis IX all became available for moral theater. Their historical complexity could be simplified into recognizable roles. Those roles then fed national and religious memory, art, literature, and eventually mass culture. Once again, the remaking of the Mediterranean was not only military and commercial. It was narrative. The role of Eastern Christians should also be restored to view. Armenians, Syriac Christians, Greek Orthodox communities, Maronites, and others did not simply watch the Crusades as bystanders. They negotiated, suffered, collaborated, resisted, and survived in varied ways. Sometimes they saw in the Franks possible allies or useful counterweights. Sometimes they experienced Latin rule as arrogant, exploitative, or doctrinally hostile. The Latin East did not unite Christendom. It frequently revealed how divided Christendom already was. The dream of holy unity that accompanied the First Crusade repeatedly broke apart when faced with language, right, jurisdiction, and political reality. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 may be the clearest expression of this fracture, but tension long predated it. Latin chroniclers often described Byzantines as duplicitous or effeminate. Byzantine writers often described Latins as boorish, violent, and spiritually immature. These stereotypes matter because they shaped behavior. Mutual contempt made cooperation fragile and betrayal easier to imagine. In a different history, stronger and more lasting Byzantine-Latin alignment might have profoundly altered the crusading centuries. In the history that happened, mistrust repeatedly weakened Christendom from within. The economic consequences of crusading contact extended beyond port cities and merchant elites. Demand for Eastern goods altered Western appetites. Luxury textiles, spices, sugar, glass, dyes, and other commodities became more deeply woven into elite consumption. Some goods were already known in Europe, of course, but the intensity and regularity of demand expanded. Consumption changed aspiration, and aspiration change trade. Mediterranean networks that linked Muslim, Byzantine, Jewish, and Latin merchants were not created by crusading, but crusading shaped the circumstances under which such networks flourished, shifted, or hardened. Sugar is a revealing case. Cultivation in the eastern Mediterranean under Crusader and later other regimes tied together conquest, agriculture, labor, and high-value trade in ways that anticipate later colonial systems. One must be careful not to project too directly from medieval Levantine sugar to the plantation complex of the early modern Atlantic. They are not the same, yet they belong to a longer history in which conquest and commercial agriculture met on fertile ground. Crusading helped make the Mediterranean a laboratory for such interactions. The same can be said, in a different register, for slavery. The Crusades took place in a world where slavery existed in many forms and in many polities. Mediterranean slavery did not begin with them, but warfare, piracy, commerce, and border violence all fed captive taking and slave movement. The crusading era did not eliminate slavery through Christian piety or Muslim law. It adapted older systems to new political and military realities. Here, too, the language of holiness failed to restrain the practical appetites of power. By the 13th century, the Mediterranean was further transformed by a force that at first seemed external to the crusading story, the Mongols. Their invasions shattered old power balances across Eurasia and the Near East. Crusader states, Muslim powers, Byzantines, and Western rulers all had to reconsider alliances and possibilities in light of this immense new shock. Some Western leaders entertained the fantasy of Franco-Mongol cooperation against Muslim powers. Some local actors adjusted as best they could to a rapidly reconfigured world. The Mongol eruption reminds us that the Crusades were not the only great engine of change in the era. But even here, the institutions, habits, and diplomatic imaginations formed during the crusading centuries shaped how people responded. The Mamluk Sultanate's success against both Crusader states and Mongol threats is one of the great political achievements of the later medieval Eastern Mediterranean. Under rulers such as Baybars and his successors, the Mamluks combined military skill, administrative capacity, and ideological legitimacy to dismantle the remaining Latin enclaves. The fall of Acre in 1291 was not simply a lost port. It symbolized the collapse of nearly 2 centuries of Frankish statecraft in the Levant. Yet the Mamluks did not inherit a world unchanged by those centuries. They inherited a Mediterranean already reorganized by fortified coasts, trade competition, military orders, maritime rivalry, and a long memory of holy war. What survived after Acre was not the old Crusader geography, but the crusading disposition. Calls for new expeditions continued. Plans circulated. Taxes and preaching mechanisms persisted. The language of crusade could now be directed not only toward the Holy Land, but toward the Iberian Peninsula, the Baltic, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, or internal enemies. A political tool, once invented and emotionally ratified, rarely disappears neatly when its original theater closes. It mutates. That mutation is one of the most important long-term consequences of the crusading movement. The Iberian context is especially significant because later memory often folds it into the Reconquista as though that were a single, seamless crusading project. The reality was far more complex. Christian and Muslim polities in Iberia fought, allied, intermarried, traded, and coexisted in shifting patterns over centuries. Yet papal crusading language and privilege increasingly shaped some phases of these conflicts, especially as later campaigns against Al-Andalus were integrated into broader Christian militant ideology. Here again, a Mediterranean frontier was being remade through the fusion of local politics and trans-regional sacred authorization. The Baltic Crusades further demonstrate how crusading could become a model of expansion tied to settlement, conversion, and subjugation. Orders like the Teutonic Knights carried crusading methods into northeastern Europe, where the language of war against pagans overlapped with political conquest and colonial project. Although geographically distant from Jerusalem, these campaigns show what the Crusades had become, a transferable script for legitimizing violent expansion in the name of Christendom. One should also mention the Children's Crusade, or rather the set of later narratives grouped under that name. Whether the event as popularly imagined actually occurred in coherent form remains doubtful. The sources are confused and later retellings romanticized. But the persistence of the story itself is revealing. Medieval and later Christians were drawn to a version of crusading purified of cynical power politics and embodied in innocent zeal. Even the myths generated by crusading tell us about dissatisfaction with its real outcomes. When reality disappoints, cultures produce stories that recover imagined purity. The destruction of the Templars in the early 14th century is another sign that crusading institutions had grown too powerful, too wealthy, and too politically exposed to remain untouched. King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted and power-conscious, moved against the order with charges of heresy and corruption that remained deeply suspect. The papacy, weakened and pressured, did not save the Templars. Their fall shows that what Crusade had built, later politics could dismantle. Yet the very drama of the Templars' suppression ensured that the order would live on in myth far beyond its historical end. Once again, crusading institutions were remade as memory objects as well as historical actors. What, then, of knowledge transfer? Here one must tread carefully between two lazy extremes. The old civilizational boast that the Crusades awakened Europe by exposing it to a superior East, and the equally lazy dismissal that the Crusades were culturally sterile violence. Reality lies elsewhere. The Mediterranean was already a zone of exchange before crusading, and knowledge moved through translation movements, commerce, diplomacy, and coexistence as much as through war. But the Crusades thickened certain channels of contact and desire. Europeans encountered new goods, new military problems, new urban forms, and new horizons of travel. They did not become enlightened because they killed and were killed in the Levant. They became more entangled in a Mediterranean world from which they could not emerge unchanged. Maps changed too, not always literally at first, but conceptually. Jerusalem had long occupied a sacred center in Christian imagination, yet crusading made the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean newly urgent to broad sections of Western society. Antioch, Acre, Tripoli, Edessa, Damascus, Cairo, and Constantinople became names that mattered in wider public discourse. Sacred and strategic geography merged. This kind of remapping matters. People fight differently when distant places become emotionally near. One can even see the Crusades as an education in scale. Western Europeans learned to organize movement across longer distances, on larger terms, and with more sustained support than many had before. This did not mean they mastered such organization. Crusading history is filled with supply failures and strategic incompetence. But repeated large-scale expeditions taught rulers, nobles, churchmen, and maritime powers what such movement required. The Mediterranean became a school of military logistics as much as a theater of sanctified violence. There is also the question of language itself. The word crusade came later in form, but the conceptual field around taking the cross, vow-making, indulgence, and penitential warfare became extraordinarily fertile. Once language for holy mobilization exists, it rarely remains in one century. It can be revived, secularized, mocked, or weaponized anew. Modern politics has repeatedly borrowed crusading metaphors, sometimes carelessly, sometimes with chilling self-awareness. That is not because the medieval crusades were identical to later projects. It is because they created a durable script in which moral certainty authorizes organized struggle against a named evil. The afterlife of that script reaches far beyond medieval history. The modern memory of the Crusades in the Middle East also deserves attention. While medieval Muslim chroniclers certainly recorded and interpreted these wars, the Crusades did not always occupy the same place in public political memory that they do today. In the 19th and 20th centuries, amid European imperial expansion and anti-colonial struggle, the Crusades were often reread as early Western invasions or precedents for later domination. Figures like Saladin were revived in nationalist or civilizational narratives. Western colonialism itself sometimes invited such comparisons, whether or not colonial actors explicitly intended them. Thus, the Crusades were remade again in modern memory, not simply inherited from the Middle Ages unchanged. Western memory underwent its own transformations. Romanticism, nationalism, imperial confidence, and later scholarly revision all produced different crusades for different times. 19th century painters and novelists could aestheticize crusading chivalry. 20th century scholars could strip away some of that glamour and focus on structures, violence, and material realities. Popular culture still oscillates between heroism and barbarism. The difficulty of getting the Crusades right in public imagination is itself evidence of how loaded the subject remains. The best way to keep balance is to remember scale and texture together. On the scale of empires, the Crusades altered the trajectories of papal authority, Byzantine decline, Muslim consolidation, maritime commerce, and the political centrality of the Eastern Mediterranean. On the scale of texture, they altered the life of a pilgrim inn, a village church collection, a shipwright's contract, a widow managing a crusader estate, a Jewish family fearing the crowd, an Armenian intermediary navigating multiple Christianities, a Muslim jurist framing resistance, or a Venetian merchant pricing freight. The Mediterranean was remade because both scales moved at once. And there is the city. So much of this story is urban. Jerusalem, Antioch, Acre, Tyre, Damascus, Cairo, Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, cities concentrated wealth, memory, administration, and violence. A crusade could begin in a sermon, but it had to pass through cities to matter. Cities financed it, housed it, taxed it, argued about it, remembered it, and suffered from it. The Mediterranean is often imagined through sea and coast, but urban institutions gave those waters political form. If the Crusades have a final lesson, it is not the cheap lesson that religion always causes violence or that civilizations are doomed to clash. Those formulations are too simple to be useful. The deeper lesson is that when institutions learn to sanctify force, to channel mass emotion across distance, and to translate local anxieties into trans-regional struggle, the effects can long outlast the original campaign. The Crusades were successful enough to become repeatable and failed enough to become self-questioning. That combination made them transformative. A total success might have ended the story. A total failure might have discredited it. Instead, partial victories and repeated disappointments kept the machinery alive. The Mediterranean that emerged by the later Middle Ages was one in which Christian and Muslim powers knew each other better, feared each other differently, traded more intensely, fortified more heavily, and remembered each other through deeper layers of narrative than before. Byzantium was weaker. Italian maritime powers were stronger. The papacy had tested the reach of its militant claims. Muslim rulers had learned the political value of unified resistance and the strategic necessity of controlling Egypt and Syria together. Military orders, castles, pilgrimage routes, shipping contracts, urban privileges, and memories of massacre all formed part of the new landscape. This was not the only transformation of the medieval Mediterranean, but it was one of the central ones. The Crusades turned the sea into a more explicitly contested corridor between rival religious political worlds, even as that contest produced richer entanglement and exchange. That is the paradox at the heart of the whole story. Holy war did not seal worlds off from one another. It made them touch more violently, more profitably, and more memorably than before. So the Crusades were not merely a series of wars over Jerusalem. They were an age in which Latin Christendom discovered new ways to imagine itself, in which Muslim rulers discovered new ways to mobilize legitimacy, in which Byzantium discovered that Western aid could become mortal danger, in which maritime republics discovered how to turn sacred transport into secular power, and in which the Mediterranean itself became a more militarized, commercialized, and ideologically loaded world. That world did not vanish when the last Crusader city fell. Its institutions, scars, and stories remained. And that is why the Crusades still matter. Not because they offer easy heroes or villains, and not because they can be recruited honestly into simple modern slogans, but because they show how profoundly a society can be transformed when pilgrimage, penance, empire, profit, fear, and theology are fused into one engine of action. The Mediterranean before the Crusades was already a world of contact. The Mediterranean after them was a world more densely armed with memory. The sea remained the same. The moral and political geography around it had been remade. One way to feel how unusual the crusading phenomenon is to focus on the ritual of taking the cross. A crusade did not begin only when armies marched. It began when bodies were marked. The cloth cross sewn onto a garment was a visible sign of vow, obligation, and transformed identity. Men who took the cross became, in theory, temporary pilgrims of war. They acquired spiritual privileges, social expectations, and legal complications. Their families and neighbors could see the vow stitched onto them. That visibility mattered. It turned private intention into public identity. It also made backing away harder. To take the cross and then fail to go was not merely a logistical lapse. It was a moral problem requiring commutation, delay, excuse, or censure. Preachers understood the emotional power of that ritual. Sermons for crusade were performances of compression. They condensed distant geography into immediate obligation. They transformed Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, Constantinople, or Egypt into morally vivid places for listeners who might never have traveled farther than a regional fair. The preacher's work was not simply to inform but to move, to bind sin, fear, honor, and salvation into one decision. He had to convince listeners that their eternal condition could be connected to a military expedition across sea and land. When that persuasion succeeded, it succeeded with astonishing force. When it failed, it often failed because practical realities, debt, inheritance, local duties, lack of funds, asserted themselves against devotional intensity. Funding was relentless. Crusade taxation, loans against estates, mortgaging of land, sales of rights, and appeals to ecclesiastical revenue all created a constant political economy of holy war. No ruler or pope could summon armies indefinitely on enthusiasm alone. Someone had to pay for ships, animals, grain, armor, arrowheads, timber, engineers, and garrisons. The history of crusading is therefore full of negotiations over money that sit awkwardly beside the language of salvation. That awkwardness is not incidental. It is part of the point. The Crusades remade the Mediterranean partly because they taught medieval societies how to mobilize large resources for ideologically charged long-distance projects. In doing so, they blurred the line between treasury and altar, tax and penance. Relics helped bridge that line. The crusading era was saturated with relic devotion, and relics traveled with armies, crowned victories, justified cities, and stabilized morale. The true cross, the holy lance, saints' bones, fragments associated with Christ or the apostles. Such objects were not decorative accessories to faith. They were charged matter, proof that sacred history could inhabit present time. Carrying relics into battle or establishing their presence in newly conquered spaces made conquest feel not merely strategic, but cosmically ratified. Yet relics could also become points of anxiety. If a relic was lost, captured, or exposed as dubious, what did that say about divine favor? The crusading world lived close to these questions. Acre in the 13th century offers an especially useful window into the late crusading Mediterranean. By then, after the loss and partial recoveries of Jerusalem and other inland positions, Acre had become one of the great hinge cities of the Crusader world, a port, market, administrative center, diplomatic crossroads, and fortress. Inside Acre, one could see many of the Crusades' transformations at once. Military orders maintained compounds. Merchants from Italian cities negotiated privileges. Pilgrims arrived with expectations shaped by sermons far away. Eastern Christians and Muslims navigated a city governed by Latin power, yet dependent on wider regional systems. Legal courts, warehouses, shipyards, chapels, taverns, counting rooms, and barracks all existed within a compressed urban world built from crusading persistence. When Acre fell in 1291, it symbolized not just the loss of a city but the collapse of a whole mode of Latin presence in the Levant. The daily life of such a city reminds us that the Crusades were made not only by kings and sultans but by clerks, sailors, translators, muleteers, masons, scribes, innkeepers, armorers, and brokers. The Mediterranean after the Crusades was full of people who specialized in crossing boundaries: linguistic, legal, confessional, commercial. Interpreters were indispensable. So were men familiar with measures, currencies, routes, and customs different from their own. A merchant or official who could navigate between Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and Latin worlds possessed a practical power that pure ideology could not replace. These cross-cultural middle figures seldom dominate popular memory. yet they were among the most important human infrastructure of the crusading age. The same is true of sailors. Maritime transport is often hidden behind the more glamorous imagery of knights and siege towers, but ships determined more than most lords did. Weather windows, port capacity, convoy protection, and the cost of carrying horses across the sea were decisive constraints. Medieval fleets did not operate as fantasy armadas immune to risk. They were subject to storms, rot, delay, disease, and disputes over payment. A crusade could stall because the sea did not cooperate, or because the price of transport exceeded what magnates had imagined. The Mediterranean remade by the Crusades was therefore also a Mediterranean increasingly interpreted through maritime calculation. Sea knowledge became strategic knowledge. There was also a cultural education in seeing enemy space. Latin Christians who reached the eastern Mediterranean encountered city forms, irrigation systems, markets, fortifications, bathing customs, scholarly traditions, and legal administrative practices different from many of their own. Not all reacted with admiration. Many reacted with suspicion, disdain, or selective appropriation. But encounter left traces. Chronicles record wonder as well as hatred. Pilgrims and warriors described buildings, foods, climates, and social habits they found alien or alluring. The Mediterranean became more densely observed because so many more Western eyes were turned toward it in expectation, fear, and desire. Of course, Muslim societies were also observing. Frankish settlements and armies became objects of description, categorization, ridicule, and strategic assessment. Arabic chroniclers and memoirists did not simply record invasions. They tried to explain the newcomers, their habits, strengths, piety, dirtiness, ferocity, courage, and ignorance. They learned where Frankish forces were resilient and where they were brittle, how they fortified, how they negotiated, what provoked them, and how long they could be expected to hold under pressure. Crusading made the Latin West less mythical and more concrete in Islamic political thought, even if that concreteness remained filtered through polemic and cultural distance. The crusading centuries also mattered for slavery and captivity in a more immediate human sense than broad structural accounts can show. Ransom was a constant feature of warfare in the Mediterranean, and crusading intensified the systems around it. Captives could be ransomed, enslaved, exchanged, or held for intelligence and leverage. Religious orders and charitable institutions sometimes became involved in redemption work. Families mortgaged property to retrieve relatives. Entire local economies could be touched by the capture of one notable man or the loss of a ship's crew. The border world of Crusade was a world in which persons could become transferable assets with alarming speed. From the Western side, chroniclers often emphasized martyrdom and endurance under Muslim captivity. From the Eastern side, the Franks were likewise capable of imprisoning, enslaving, and brutalizing. Neither side held a monopoly on sanctified self-pity. And that should make us careful with sources. Crusading narratives are full of suffering, but suffering is often told through partisan grammar. The task of serious history is not to flatten that grammar, but to read through it. When a chronicler reports atrocity, miracle, or exceptional courage, he may be telling the truth, shaping memory, or both. The Crusades also changed the visual culture of sanctity and warfare. Cross motifs, heraldic memory, reliquary art, church decoration, and manuscript illustration all absorbed crusading themes. Saints could be imagined as protectors of campaigns. Jerusalem could appear not merely as biblical place, but as contemporary objective. Art made the geography of Crusade familiar to people who would never leave Europe. In this sense, the Mediterranean was being remade in imagination as well as in ships and fortresses. Visual culture taught people what was at stake and what kinds of violence might be treated as holy. The built environment in Europe changed too. Military orders constructed churches, commanderies, barns, residences, and financial administrative sites that tied local landscapes to Levantine struggle. Donations of land to the Templars or Hospitallers meant that a field in France or England could become materially connected to warfare in Syria or Palestine. Crusading thus stretched the Mediterranean into Europe not only through news and devotion, but through property relations. A peasant laboring on land owned by a military order was, in a distant but real sense, part of the crusading system. There is a tendency in some modern retellings to present the Crusades as obvious failures because they did not permanently secure Jerusalem or produce a lasting Christian Levant. By that metric, yes, they failed. But from the perspective of institutional history, they were also astonishingly productive. They generated durable orders, taxes, laws, architectural forms, memory traditions, diplomatic habits, and maritime commercial alignments. They could fail in their stated objective and still succeed in remaking the world that launched them. That paradox is essential. It explains why the Crusades matter far beyond battlefield wins and losses. Another underappreciated dimension is time. Crusaders and their opponents alike often thought in eschatological or providential terms, yet campaigns unfolded in painfully ordinary durations. Seasons, harvests, contract terms, wind patterns, inheritance disputes, and disease cycles. Holy war had to fit inside agricultural calendars and shipping calendars. Kings could swear vows quickly and fulfill them years later or never. Cities under siege might hold because winter came. Appeals for aid could arrive too late. Sacred urgency and logistical time lived in constant tension. The Mediterranean was remade partly by the repeated frustration produced when transcendent goals collided with the calendar. One sees that tension vividly in the career of Louis IX. His sanctity and later memory can tempt viewers to imagine a cleaner alignment between piety and strategy than actually existed. Louis was unquestionably devout. Yet piety did not solve the operational problems of invading Egypt, holding Damietta, or surviving disease and counterattack. His crusades show that saintly intention could still yield political disaster. And yet, because crusading was as much moral theater as strategy, disaster did not erase sanctity. The story could be retold as noble suffering in service of Christendom. A movement capable of metabolizing defeat in that way is difficult to extinguish. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, proposals for new crusades proliferated in written form, often increasingly detached from practical means. Treatises described routes, alliances, fiscal mechanisms, and reform programs for future success. This literature is historically important because it shows crusading becoming a genre of planning as much as action. Men who could not recover the Holy Land could still imagine how it ought to be done next time. Imagination itself became institutionalized. The Mediterranean remained mentally conquerable long after it was politically resistant. This forward-projecting imagination also fed cartography and global thought. Once Latin Christians had spent generations thinking of the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land as spaces of both sacred urgency and strategic complexity, those regions occupied a firmer place in Western world models. Crusading did not invent geography, but it intensified the desire to know routes, ports, coastlines, and distances. Knowledge gathered for holy war could be repurposed for trade, diplomacy, or later expansion. There is also the question of language and translation in a more literal sense. The crusading world sat beside, and sometimes inside, translation movements through which scientific, philosophical, and medical texts moved from Arabic and Greek into Latin. Spain and Sicily are often more central here than the Levant, but the broader thickening of Mediterranean contact made intellectual transfer part of the age's texture. Again, one must avoid sentimental claims that crusaders kindly carried knowledge home. Much of the movement of knowledge occurred through scholars, translators, courts, merchants, and multilingual societies not reducible to crusading armies. Still, an age that trained Western elites to think intensely about the Eastern Mediterranean also made them more attentive to what lay there. Modern invocations of crusade often strip away this complexity and retain only confrontation. That itself is a legacy. Once a historical event becomes a ready-made symbol of righteous struggle, later actors can ignore its actual messiness and use it as emotional shorthand. The danger is not only anachronism. It is that such shorthand can reactivate old civilizational scripts in contexts where they mislead or inflame. The medieval crusades were historically specific. Their symbolic afterlife is promiscuous. That is one reason it remains important to tell the story carefully. Carefully means holding together contradiction. The Crusades were spiritually serious for many participants and materially opportunistic for many others, often in the same person. They produced massacres and charities, monastic discipline and aristocratic greed, visions and contracts, saints and looters, martyrs and profiteers. They linked ports more tightly while hardening confessional identities. They encouraged exchange while normalizing atrocity. They were not reducible to one moral note. The Mediterranean they remade was likewise contradictory, more connected and more hostile, richer and more militarized, more mobile and more fortified, more narratively shared and more bitterly divided. Perhaps the simplest way to see their legacy is to imagine the Mediterranean before and after. Before, it was already a sea of ancient empires, commercial routes, mixed cities, pilgrim roads, and religious competition. After, it was all those things still, but with new institutions of holy war, stronger maritime republics, weaker Byzantium, more intensely fortified Levantine coasts, more elaborate systems of trans-regional taxation and vow, and a deeper archive of mutual memory between Latin Christians and Muslim powers. The Crusades did not create the Mediterranean. They changed the way its peoples inhabited conflict and connection. That is a large claim, but a warranted one. The Mediterranean after the Crusades was not simply a place where people remembered Jerusalem differently. It was a place where ports handled different traffic, rulers claimed different forms of legitimacy, orders held different property, chroniclers told different stories, and ordinary believers imagined sacred geography differently. Change operated from the harbor to the household, from the papal court to the village sermon, from the walls of Acre to the ledgers of Venice. And maybe that is the most enduring truth of all. The Crusades show how a distant sacred objective can reorganize an entire region's politics, economies, institutions, and memories for generations, even when that objective is never permanently secured. Jerusalem mattered enormously, yes, but the deepest historical consequence of crusading is not that one city changed hands. It is that the struggle over that city changed the Mediterranean world around it. Holy war radiated outward. It traveled by ship and sermon, castle and contract, relic and rumor, vow and taxation, and by the time it lost its original strongholds, it had already remade the sea. So when we say the Crusades were holy war and the making of the Mediterranean, we should hear both halves equally. Holy war supplied the moral voltage. The Mediterranean supplied the routes, ports, rivalries, and social worlds through which that voltage moved. Neither half alone explains the transformation. Together they explain why these wars continue to cast such a long shadow, not because they belong to legend, but because they altered the structures through which legend, violence, and power could move. The men and women who lived through them did not know they were participating in something future centuries would package as the Crusades. They knew hunger, sermons, debts, fear, vows, ships, walls, plague, market prices, ransoms, relics, and the long uncertainty of whether God was truly with them. Yet from those lived pieces emerged one of the defining historical engines of the medieval world. It left the Mediterranean more crowded with memory, more disciplined by institutions of war, more entangled in commerce, and more vulnerable to the idea that killing in the name of salvation could be made to look like duty. And that, ultimately, is why the Crusades still matter. Because they reveal how much a world can be changed by people who are convinced that history, heaven, and violence have all converged on one road, one sea, and one city. The Mediterranean carried them in and out. It carried their ships, their relics, their debts, their commerce, their prisoners, and their stories. When they were done, the sea remained, but the world around it had been made into something new.